Yeah, revolutionary greetings to you all, comrades, and welcome back again to our usual sessions. Today, we want to look at this critical topic called democracy. And my interest today is to focus on democracy with a very clear understanding of what is democracy. Because many people have been asking themselves whether do Africa need democracy in our governance system? And some say, no, we don't need democracy. But there are also elements of whether democracy is a Western system or democracy is having some African rootings. And to my understanding and to my context in this conversation, I want to distinguish two things. One, I want to say that democracy is not foreign. Africa had democracy, but we practice our own democracy through consensus, unlike the West that then assumes and practices their democracy through so-called either the tyranny of number or the majority rule. But before we dive into that, permit me to take you through some serious studies. And first is that we want to understand this democracy, either the so-called Western democracy. And that takes us to refer to a very important document called the Universal Declaration on Democracy. And on the Universal Declaration on Democracy, the first part of that document that I want to focus on is the principles of democracy. Now, the first principle of democracy is that democracy is a universally recognized ideal as was a goal, which is based on common values shared by people throughout the world, community, irrespective of their cultural, their political, their economic, and their social differences. It is thus a basic right of citizenship to be exercised under conditions of freedom, equality, transparency, and responsibility, with due respect for the plurality of views and in the interest of polity. That is the first principle of democracy, that democracy is a universally recognized ideal, and its goal is based on common shared values. Now, the second principle of democracy is that democracy is both an ideal to be pursued and a mode of government to be applied. And its application should be according to modalities, which then reflect the diversity of experiences and cultural particularities without derogating from internationally recognized principles, norms, and standards. It is thus a constantly perfected and always perfectible state or condition whose progress will depend upon variety of political, social, economic, and cultural factors. Now let's analyze that word. That democracy is both an ideal to be pursued and a mode of government to be applied. But its application must be according to modalities which reflect the diversity of experience and cultural particularities. Now, that is very important, that when you then apply democracy, you must focus on diversity and cultural peculiarities and look for African context. What is our cultural peculiarities and what is our diversity? So that when you apply democracy, you apply it in our context. Then the third principle of democracy is that as an ideal, democracy aims essentially to preserve and promote the dignity and fundamental rights of the individual, to achieve social justice, to foster the economic and social development of the country, of the community, strengthen the cohesion of society, and enhance national tranquility, as well as to create a climate that is favorable for international peace. Now, as a form of government, then democracy as they say, is the best way to achieve these objectives. And it's also the only political system that has the capability for self-correction. That's according to them. Now, look at that element. When they say that then the democracy aims essentially to preserve and promote dignity. Dignity. But I don't have problem with dignity. It goes on to say fundamental rights of individual. That's where we divert. Fundamental right of individual. So democracy is based on individualism to advance societal goal, which they say to enhance or strengthen the cohesion of society. In African context, we don't put individuals first, we put the society first. And therefore, individualism can only be exercised at the expense of society. So we then embrace communalism, which is Ubuntu in us. I am because you are. So my individual rights should be based on also your individual right as a society. But then let's look at the fourth principle of democracy. The fourth principle of democracy says that the achievement of democracy presupposes a genuine partnership in order to achieve democracy between men and women in the conduct of the affairs of society in which they work in equality and complementarity, drawing mutual enrichment from their differences. The achievement of democracy, as the fourth principle, presupposes a genuine partnership between men and women in the conduct of the affairs of society in which they work in equality and complementarity, drawing mutual enrichment for their differences. And the fifth principle of democracy says that a state of democracy ensures that the processes by which power is ascended to, wielded, or alternates allows for free political competition and are the product of open, fair, and non-discriminatory participation of the people, exercised in accordance with the rule of law in both letter and spirit. In both letter and spirit. The things this where people then came up with the element of the ballot, so that the democracy then be pursued through the ballot. And they say that in the only way then that power can be ascended to or alternate is through the ballot, probably from that principle. And that in that ballot, there must be a free political competition. And that the product of that should be of an open, free, and non-discriminatory participation of or by the people. I think that's why everybody now has the universal right to vote, irrespective of your gender and maybe you are anything else. But of course, then there's age for eligibility to vote. But then the last element of that question is very important. That point is, it says that it should be exercised in accordance with the rule of law. And the rule of law of transparency, fairness, and openness must be in both the letter and spirit. Now, that is where most of African countries fail. And not only most of Africa, most of election across the world fail. Because there's nothing fair in most of those democracy or the ballot process, and there's nothing transparent enough. But let's look then the sixth principle of democracy. The sixth principle of democracy says that democracy is inseparable from the rights set forth in the international instruments recalled in the preamble. Therefore, this right must therefore be applied effectively, and their proper exercise must be merged with individual and collective responsibilities. Democracy, I repeat again, sixth principle, is inseparable from the rights set forth in international instruments recalled in the preamble. Therefore, these rights must therefore be applied effectively, and their proper exercise must be merged with individual and collective responsibility. Now, the seventh and the second last principle is that democracy is founded on the primacy of the law. democracy is founded on the primacy of the law and the exercise of human rights. In a democratic state, listen to that. In a democratic state, no one is above the law. I repeat again. No one is above the law, and all are equal before the law. And all are equal before the law. We know very well. In many of our countries, there are people above the law. The presidents are above the law. The ministers sometimes are above the law. And it depends on who do you know. So it means basically there's nothing of such called democracy as per that principle. 7. Cause we know so many people are above the law. In the story of that, the animal farm, that all animals are equal, but other animals are more equal than others. And that's what we exercise here. Democracy envision that no one should be above the law and that all should be equal before the law. But today, if you have money, if you have connection, if you have political power, you are above the law. And that has happened several times. We've seen that. But then let's look at the last principle of democracy. That democracy talks about that the peace and economic, social, and cultural development are both conditions for and fruits of democracy. Peace and economic, social, and cultural development. Cultural development are both conditions for and fruits of democracy. Then he says, there is thus interdependence between peace, development, respect for, and observance of the rule of law and human rights. Those are the 8 principles of democracy. Thank you very much. And let's have an engagement on any other thing as we move along.